By this time, I know you feel like you've probably been drinking from a fire hydrant, but I trust that your pail is altogether full. But you've got to make just a little more room, because we're about to hear from one of the heroes of the faith of our time. David Bahnsen is one of the nation's top financial advisors. He's the founder and the chief investment officer of the Bahnsen Group. He is a regular contributor. You may have seen him on Fox News or on Bloomberg, or you may listen to him, as I always do, on the wonderful podcast, The World and Everything in It, from World Magazine. He's written a number of incredibly helpful books, including The Crisis of Responsibility and There's No Free Lunch. But his newest book, I think, may be his best. It's simply entitled Full Time: Work and the Meaning of Life. I've been wanting to have David here for years, and here he is. It is my joy to welcome David Bahnsen to ACCS.
Thank you, brother. Well, it is wonderful to be with you all. I have been excited for this address since it was first booked, for a number of reasons that I hope will become clear by the time I am done. I'm always excited to talk about this book, this message, this subject that harmonizes some of the things that I personally am most passionate about and I feel most called to. I think that God has a specific plan for my life. He expects me to execute on that plan full time, and a good portion of the message that I am most passionate about is going to be embodied in the things I talk to you about today. But the reason I say I've been particularly excited to talk to this audience is, first of all, I say that to every audience I speak to. So that's not true. I'm being very serious right now. There is leverage in this room. And I believe that there is an opportunity at times. Yesterday, I spoke to a group of about 75 people at a church here in Atlanta, and I hope the message resonated. I hope that there were younger people and older people that took the message and applied it in the different contexts of their lives. I usually have a lot of confidence that some good will come out of the delivery, the faithful delivery of a faithful message. I feel good about. The difference in speaking to this room and the role that you all play in your context is this word I'm referring to of leverage. The notion that a properly understood theology of work and a properly applied message around vocational calling, our identity, and what it means to be truly human, I believe that there is an ability to, rather than just portray it to 75 people in a room of 75 or to 1,200 in a room of 1,200, is that this has the opportunity to be leveraged to a message of tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people, and of course, multi-generationally even more. And the reason that's important to me is because I think it is, in a lot of ways, juxtaposition, the subject of education in which you all live and the subject of work, that this juxtaposition of these two subjects are by far the greatest instruments we have for kingdom building available in 2024 and in the years and decades that will be to come. There are other fields which are vitally important. I have an extremely Kuyperian view of the kingdom of God, I take every square inch seriously. But I believe that when I'm done with my comments today, I hope that the message of the marketplace will be understood in the same way that all of us understand education as a vital and leverageable instrument to growing the kingdom of God. Now, let me get the hard part out of the way. Sometimes when I speak on this message, I get to deliver something that's pretty soft, it's pretty friendly. There's people, it's almost like career advice talk. People know that I have a successful wealth management company. They know I work in Wall Street. They might see me on TV and they say, will you come talk to our young people? You're still a believer even though you work in that New York place, right? Will you come talk to our folks in our congregation or in our school or in some setting as to how they can feel better about their job? And so it's almost a little bit more therapeutic, in the message I'm giving. But I said, if I accepted this invitation to come here, I need permission to really get in the deep end of the pool with you. I want to do something deeply theological and deeply philosophical today to get my message through. And so in order to do that, I'm going to start with a very important question. How many of you watch Hallmark movies? All right, now I can't exactly tell, and I don't have really good eyesight, so even if I thought I saw a certain number of hands, I wouldn't trust it. But I'm going to assume that it was somewhere around a third of you who raised your hand, a third of you who are lying, and a third of you who don't watch Hallmark movies. My purpose in this book and in the talk I want to give today will be to totally change the fundamental message of Hallmark movies. And what do I mean by this? And by the way, it isn't just Hallmark movies. My wife and I are very happy to admit that we will watch these during the holiday season, and they become sort of entertainment. It really is only one movie, and it's been made like 48 times. But the fundamental message of the Hallmark movie is not all that different than a lot of other Hollywood messages and a lot of Christian messages, church, school, sometimes entertainment vehicles. And it's some version of this, to use the Hallmark caricature. There's some person, we're going to assume it's a guy. Is that okay? I just always get the gender stuff out of the way, right off the top. Thank you. We're going to assume that there's a guy who's in some city somewhere working, and he works a lot, and he works hard, and he's busy and sometimes stressed. He might miss certain things. But then there's some family event or a high school reunion or some kind of a deal that pulls him back to some particular town, and then in the course of the movie, he rediscovers what's really important in life, which is not his career, but saving the town's fire station or reuniting with an ex-girlfriend from high school or one of these kinds of things. And it's usually somewhat benign. It isn't the type of thing that I lose sleep over demonizing, but I am aware of what the implicit message is. And the implicit message is that this work stuff, career stuff, success, ambition, achievement, aspiration, productivity, it's getting in the way. And sometimes in the church, we say it's getting in the way of family. Sometimes in the church, we say it's getting in the way of ministry. And sometimes in the pop culture, we say it's getting in the way of social justice or some other more, let's say, left-wing type message. But the sentimentality of the Hallmark movie is somewhat systemic, is it not? And it is always the universally accepted thing to demonize is someone who dares to take their job seriously. And I am tired of it. I am completely sick and tired of a Hollywood message that every single time work must be, achievement must be the thing getting in the way. Now again, Hollywood doesn't actually believe that. Those guys work really hard. You should see their paychecks. They have this sort of incipient hypocrisy that allows them to demonize the very thing that they do. And it was a huge part of the inspiration for my book. And I'm getting to where the bigger passion I have is for a Christian engagement with this subject, but I want to just kind of get the world stuff out of the way. If I have to read another article in the Atlantic or the New Yorker or what have you, and there will be another one next month, you can set your clock to it. Some version of a writer who loves their job, who has a socioeconomic strata that comes from their job, who probably doesn't yet have a family because they're so focused in their job, writing an article about how, gosh darn it, people's jobs are getting in the way of them being happy, and isn't it awful that so many people are so committed to their jobs. I think that message is systemic in the world, but it is at least hypocritical. They don't actually believe it in Hollywood, in some of the pop media. But where my focus is in writing the book, Full-Time Work and the Meaning of Life, is that unfortunately, I think a sort of dualism that, unlike the left, whose real agenda in Hollywood and demonizing people who work too hard is to demonize free markets, to demonize free enterprise, to demonize what they would call capitalism, to demonize some form of private property, some form of aspiration, success. They have an agenda, and I think that oftentimes in a Christian world, there is a similar message, but it is driven by a different agenda. That the Christian church, by and large, in all of its closet dualism, is not frustrated by the same things Hallmark or Hollywood or the New Yorker is. But nevertheless, they're frustrated by something that they need not be frustrated by, for the very simple simple reason that what they're frustrated by is something that God himself made, that God himself designed. And it is the notion of the human person being created for the purpose of work and for the purpose of a given calling that is tied to a productive activity. That, yes, may very well require them sometimes to have their mind actually focused on it. And I think that this is the underlying emotional moment that I'm seeking to deal with, because the theological moment for Christians is reasonably non-controversial, as we'll soon see when I unpack Genesis chapter 1. The emotional moment is in the application of the message. Do we have the courage to see this all the way through? And that's what I want to challenge us with here this morning. When I say it starts in Genesis 1, it would be useful for me to make clear that I believe everything starts in Genesis 1. So I'm merely doing what I like to do with all subjects when I want to dig deeper into them. And in a theology of work, I want to start in the Garden of Eden. But George mentioned my book prior to Full-Time was called There's No Free Lunch, 250 Economic Truths. And in a lot of ways, I think these topics overlap a great deal for reasons I'm going to get to in a second. But let me just say, for those of you who are educators in the room who have a passion for economics, or who believe that oftentimes our kids, regardless of grade level, are perhaps being shortchanged in economics, and are wondering where a distinctly Christian understanding of economics ought to come from, I will say that all I did with that book is the same thing with this one, is start in Genesis chapter 1. And because I believe a thorough understanding of a biblical world and life view essentially deals with a doctrine of creation, understanding a doctrine of the fall, moving into this process and era of redemption, and ultimately ending in the consummation of history and this great hope for new heavens and new earth. This basic sequential understanding is vital, and yet it starts with creation. And I believe you will find it low-hanging fruit. No pun intended. I just made that up right now. Low-hanging fruit for the way in which Genesis 1 speaks to a theology of work. The first 25 verses of Genesis chapter 1 are utterly beautiful for those who take the time to read and appreciate them. If you have been a believer for some period of time and you read the creation account, perhaps early in your faith, and over the years have had opportunity to incidentally revisit it, but you just find yourself right now not having read the book, the chapter of Genesis 1 for some time, I encourage you to reread it. It is staggering to me to read of what God was doing day by day in the first 25 verses of Genesis, and then the subtlety and the understatedness with which he says, after creating, the oceans, it was good. The mountains, it was good. The sun, moon, and stars, it was good. And God goes through and creates the expanse of the universe. And as he is creating the physical world, is describing each of his own acts of productive creation, good, 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 and good. And then verses 26 through 28 get to a moment here that have often been termed in different contexts the creation mandate, the dominion mandate, and those verses have been used for a plethora of reasons throughout history, and often, and I would say most often, correctly and fairly. They can be used to drive a certain agenda, and I don't mean that pejoratively. I think it can be a good and appropriate exegesis to apply those verses to a given agenda. But then he goes back to, in verse 29, describing how he had made mankind. And verses 26 to 28, he tells us what he made mankind for. And then he concludes Genesis chapter 1 by saying, after looking at his creation of mankind, it was very good. I believe in verse 31. Somehow, you and me got very good status. And the oceans, mountains, moon, sun, and stars got good status. The animal kingdom, the plant kingdom, they got something different in the hierarchy, something different grammatical, the adverb that modified the adjective of good was intensified, and it was intensified for a very specific and very clear-cut reason theologically, and that is that nothing in God's creation was made in his image and likeness but us. Nothing was made with the elevated dignity that we were made with. This is where we derive a belief in the sanctity of human life, because God told us that we are dignified, that there is an elevated status, and that he made us so he could be with us. The Emmanuel principle of God with us, to me, in my theology, being the story of history. And that you and I live in a period of history, post-creation, that is pre-consummation. That what God is recreating us to in this era that was made possible by the work of his Son on the cross is recreating us to the state of the garden. And what was that state of the garden? What did he ask Adam and Eve to do in verses 26 through 28? To be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Let's start there, because this is what I mean by a lot of people who are advocates of big families will use those verses. And I think it's essentially correct. I don't believe that when God said, be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth, that it doesn't mean to have a lot of kids. I'm all for that. But it doesn't only mean to have a lot of kids unless you believe that those kids are going to get their meals from nowhere. That they are going to travel down roads that don't exist and function in a pre-civilization component, a pre-civilization society that is essentially, if you think about it for 2 seconds, this doesn't take a ton of unwrapping in your mind to realize how obvious what I'm saying is. The commandment to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth requires what? It requires infrastructure. It requires civilization. It requires the humankind that was to go be fruitful, active, productive, to have a theology, an economics, if you will, of growth. Otherwise, all the kids you have are not going to really have a very flourishing life, are they? And of course, on the other side of the fall, they're going to die. The work we do to be faithful to the commandment of being fruitful and multiplying and filling the earth is a cultivation of God's created world. This stewardship that is not only a part of verse 26, but goes on into 27 and 28 to have dominion over the world, to rule over it and care for it. And the words that we're now talking about in Genesis 1 and into Genesis 2, avodah and shamar, in Genesis 2:15, they were to care for the garden. The same Hebrew verb that is used to describe a shepherd caring for his sheep, the way in which God cares for us, cultivation, an avodah, that we were to go work in the garden, the same Hebrew word used in the fourth commandment. So we're clearly talking about a vocational work. 6 days thou shalt work and do all thy labor. This is the avo, the Hebrew prefix that we're talking about, used thousands of times in Hebrew text. To work, to worship, and to serve. The same word used in the book of Joshua. Choose this day whom you will serve. But also used interchangeably to describe worship of God and to describe what is clearly vocational work, the fourth commandment. This is all before sin, before the serpent, before the fruit. And this idea that we are made very good, that we have an elevated status, comes from what is said 4 times in 2 verses in the middle of Genesis 1, that we and we alone are made in the image and likeness of God. We bear his image. And I cannot believe how many Christians I have talked to in my 50 years on earth. And let's be honest, I didn't have this conversation until I was about age 5 or 6. So really, even though I'm now age 50, I've only been talking about this with people for about 45, maybe 46 years. How many have a certain theological depth to understand this idea that we are made in God's image, but we are not God? And in fact, the very first sin, and I think all sin wraps into the sin is believing that we can be God. Man's attempt to be godlike is the essence of sin. And yet, how many Christians have ever asked, what does it mean to be made in the image of God? Because I think we intuitively know some of the things it doesn't mean. There are attributes we do not share with God. In his transcendence, we are not omnipresent, we are not omniscient, we are not omnipotent. And that is reasonably known. But then what does it affirmatively or positively mean to bear the image of God? In the context of verses 26 through 28, the verses in which he's telling us that we are, go on to explain our mandate to be fruitful, to fill the earth, to be productive, to cultivate, to grow, to steward, to rule over, to build a civilization. I have used, I think, 9 different verbs this morning in going through at a very high level Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. And every single one of these verbs has a 4-letter synonym: work. To cultivate, to care, to steward, the growth, all of these different things. Essentially, in the Garden of Eden, God made us to work. And what he did, and now this brings me back and bridges to what I said I wanted to connect in my economics passion. Economics is the study of human action around the way in which we allocate scarcity. There is not an infinite amount of goods in the world, and so we economically distribute resources. That's what economics is. And it is not merely an allocation of goods, because those goods have to be defined as scarce, otherwise it ceases to be economics. It's very easy to allocate something that is infinitely available. And it isn't just an abstract allocation. It is human beings doing so. It is human activity. It requires, and tell me if this sounds familiar, an understanding of mankind acting as an individual, an image bearer of God, an individual who has an eternal destiny, a soul that can never die, but doing so in a social context, family, neighborhood, society, working both as one and many, working as both individual and collective. This is economics. This all was put together in Genesis chapter 1. And ultimately, I call work the verb of economics because it starts in Genesis 1 of God telling us he made us for that reason, and that's what it means to bear the image of God. That God himself is a creator, and he did not make the iPhone. But you know what else he didn't make? Anything since the Garden of Eden that is now a part of the iPhone. This convention center that we sit in, the airplanes that we fly, mankind's ability to start a fire was made out of the chemical compounds of creation. The ingenuity that mankind used to invent the wheel, the beauty that went in to some of ancient artwork, structures, architecture, construction, the various goods and services that we have produced throughout history to enhance our quality of life and to, yes, extract a truth, beauty, and goodness and proclaim a truth, beauty, and goodness. This is what God made us to do, and he made us to do it because he loves us, not because he hates us. Work is not a curse. It is a blessing. And as we know in our basic rudimentary theology, sin polluted everything. And the effects of sin are extensive, so much so that something as beautiful as childbirth now took on a curse, the pains of childbirth. And Genesis 3, chapter 16, when he shared that curse, he went on to the very next verse, an immediate, logical, sequential, grammatical connectivity to say, and in your work, you now have the sweat of your brow, the thorns and thistles. And so this is one of the least profound, least interesting, least novel bits of exegesis I've ever done. It's so obvious. But obviously, work is not a curse unless children are. Now, how many of you have met people that say work is a byproduct of the curse? Almost everyone has heard it at some point. Do you think anybody's willing to say that children are a curse from the Lord? But it's the exact same theological statement. God made work as a blessing, and he made it for us to be an image bearer of him in co-creating with him. This was the purpose of life, that we would take the potential of God's creation, the raw materials, and the beauty and potential of the expanse of the earth, and extract out of it with the uniquely human ingenuity, creativity, productivity, and capacity for innovation that we had, and that we would then create out of God's creation. So the theological danger would be if I were saying that mankind can create out of nothing, ex nihilo, but I am most certainly not saying that. God alone creates ex nihilo, and we, as image bearers of him, create out of his creation, ex naturam, out of the nature of what God made. We extract a potential that then is where we faithfully execute upon Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 through 28. It is how we have dominion over the earth. It is how we be fruitful, multiply, grow, fill the earth. This is what God made us for. Today, in both Christian church settings and secular Hollywood settings in which work is demonized, they may very well think they're demonizing some guy who ignores his family. I'm going to clue you in on something. The person they're going after who is aloof, insensitive, emotionally unavailable, it's always going to be a white guy in a city. And guess what? They are throwing the baby out with the bathwater the same way often Christian churches do when they give a message of you cannot allow your work to get in the way of your family. The need of the hour is not to portray a false dichotomy between being faithful to family and being faithful to our creation mandate, but to understand that they are one and the same. That I do not have the luxury of changing hats day by day throughout my life. Right now, as I stand here in front of you as an embodied person, I am a husband to my wife, Jolene, of 23 years. I am a father to my 3 children, Mitchell, Sadie, and Graham. I think it's 3. Hold on. Yeah, 3 kids. I work a lot. I apologize. I am a worker. I am a person who has various professional responsibilities, and those professional responsibilities are not merely instrumental. This is different than saying that they're not instrumental. The way in which I have supported my family has been a byproduct of the fruits of the labor. So it is entirely true when we tell our kids, eat your vegetables, we go to work to put that food on the table. It is entirely true that that food would not be there apart from us going to work to do it. But I'm sorry to all of you who have ever said it, and I'm sure I've said it over the years myself. It is untrue that the reason I went to work was to put food on the table. I put food on the table by going to work, but the reason I went to work is because I was made in the image of God to co-create with him, to produce goods and services that meet the needs of humanity, that extract the potential out of God's beautiful creation, and to live faithfully as a very good, dignified member of humanity. When I am a husband, when I am a church member, when I'm engaged in different contexts, all at once, the ontology of this is not altered. My being does not go from, right now I take the hat off of dad and I put the hat on of worker. All at once we do all the above. And this notion that the world has of having to pick between the Hallmark movie ending, do I save the town library or do I go back to my job, it is fine as some sort of silly, sappy, sentimental Hollywood moment. But think of the theological danger of the church giving the message that you must pick today between your job and your family. You must pick, and you must pick both. You must be faithful as a spouse. You must be faithful as a parent. You must be faithful in your vocational calling. We are living in a time in which we are victims of our own success in a lot of ways as a society. One chapter in my book, chapter 7, is devoted to my critique of this concept of retirement. And I knew going in that it was a theme that would be very easily misconstrued. And I try always to get in front of that stuff. It's one thing if people are going to be unfair about your argument, but it's another thing if you give them a really good reason to be unfair about your argument. And as much as it depends on you, I try to not do that, to just have a certain level of clarity. And if they're from there going to go straw man me or misrepresent me, there's nothing I can do about that. I'm okay with it. But I really worked hard to make clear what I was not saying. What I am not saying when I critique retirement is that I don't recognize any adjustment throughout the age and stage of our lives. But let me just be very clear about what I am saying. The purpose of work is not to not do it anymore. Now, you tell me how our modern retirement vernacular has not taught tens of millions of members of Gen Y and Gen Z that the purpose of work is to not do it anymore. The baby boomers were the first generation in human history that entered the workforce with an eye on something called retirement. And the baby boomers were the hardest working generation in human history, measured empirically by gross output. The baby boomers produced more goods and services than any generation we've ever had. So I give them full kudos. However, the baby boomers also, in the course of this highly successful, productive output, had an eye on something called retirement that was made possible by what? Two blessings that had never before existed in human history. A mortality that would allow such a thing, combined with a prosperity that could allow such a thing. Post-World War II America, life expectancy ended up going up about 10 years. So people were supposed to die sometime between 55 and 65. Now all of a sudden that gets pushed out 10 years. And then since then it's gotten pushed another 10. And as we sit here today, it's something around 78, 79 for men and about 81 for women. Well, I'm all for this. I think it's wonderful. I prefer our loved ones be with us longer. But retirement planning before this was called death. Madison Avenue did not have to run a lot of commercials for how you could plan and save for one day being gone because, you didn't have to think about it very much. And all of a sudden, the prosperity in the society and then various instruments became available that might be tools in helping to better efficiently plan for such a thing. IRAs, 401ks, pension plans, all this kind of stuff. And so now what happened is I think the baby boomers ran with this idea and have embedded in the psyche of society the idea that we can end our lives on a 20, 25, maybe 30-year vacation. And yes, I am critical of that. I think that we need to understand that if God made us to work, to be productive, to be active, that there wasn't an expiration date on that, even if at age and stage there will be certain limits and understandable ramifications. But if nothing else, if I can just be purely selfish about it, even if the 72-year-old who is now going to lunch with his wife every day and spending all the time they want with the grandkids and hasn't thought about the old company or classroom or whatever it may have been in years, even if they are not dissatisfied, which I don't believe. I think there's a hole there, and I think they miss being useful, and I think they miss being productive, but we'll just pretend. I miss it. I'm 50 years old. I run a successful business. I can't stand having 26-year-olds tell me what to do. I need some 76-year-olds around, some 64-year-olds around, some 59-year-olds around. These 26-year-olds are driving me crazy. But in all seriousness, this is a very easy to digest concept, is it not? There's a wisdom in experience. There's a wisdom in expertise. And hasn't the real consequence of the retirement culture mentality been to not only take people out of productive usefulness, but to take them out of the companies at which they worked, the factories, the classrooms, the different contexts in which they had skillfulness to offer? Mentorship is dying. This is, to me, a byproduct of the retirement mentality. All of these things come back to the message of how we think about education and how we think about what we're preparing young people for, whether it's in the context of being an educator or the context of being a parent. I very much want my children to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. And I very much want them to have the ability to appreciate and to see and to create themselves truth, beauty, and goodness. And the idea that what we want for our children is limited to the home or the ecclesial realm, and that the marketplace is off limits, whether it be office, factory, classroom. There's all the different contexts from farms to, I can't cover them all. So whichever one I didn't cover so far that applies to you and now you're offended, I apologize. But you know what I'm saying, and I'm just kidding. I know you're not offended, but those are the things I always worry about because I am talking from my own context a lot of the times, but I really want to apply this with a broad brush. The production of goods and services that meet the needs of humanity, this work, this vocational calling, this productive usefulness is part of our very created being. It is what we want out of our young people because, like God with us, we love them, not because we hate them. And ultimately, if you're as optimistic as I am, and I don't think oftentimes there's a lot of optimism these days amongst people that share some of the distinctives and vision and worldview we have. But I'm not one of those people that is short on optimism. I overflow with it. Optimistically, there is a time coming where we are going to be winning, and we are going to be winning because we are properly educating, equipping, and preparing our children to go forth, be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. And my friends, that includes what they do in their work. Thank you very much.
That was refreshing and delightful.
Thank you.
You had a remarkable mentor to teach you theologically and to prepare you for your life's work. Your father, friend of mine, was one of the brightest minds of his generation and a great man. You're an economist. He was a theologian. How on earth did his great work wind up influencing your work?
Well, it's a question I get asked a lot, and I think it makes a lot of sense that people would, so my father's name was David Bahnsen. He passed away getting very close to 30 years ago now, and I guess that is sort of sobering to think about how much time has gone by. But he was only 47 years old.
I had dinner with him 3 weeks before the surgery that he did not survive.
Yeah.
It was devastating.
And I think that his contribution to the world is largely thought of as being very philosophical and very theological. He was fundamentally an utterly brilliant apologist. And I think what Dad did in the field of apologetics will be with us for a long, long time. But obviously in my life, he was more than just my pastor or theologian or intellectual influence. He was my best friend. And you used the word mentor. It couldn't be more appropriate. I honestly, from the bottom of my heart, don't believe that what I'm doing is very different than what he did, other than when the paycheck comes. Okay.
Yeah, that's got to be just a little different.
What I mean by this is my dad spent his life believing that we needed to apply the world and life view of Christianity to epistemology and philosophy and ultimately the field of what we call Christian apologetics. And I believe we need to apply it to the field of economics and finance and entrepreneurialism, what today we more crassly call business. And I think we're just basically we're singing from the same hymn book in a different field, a different domain. It's a different application, but the first principles are all the same. And those are things I was taught by him. I would have rather been taught them for 30, 40, 50 years instead of 20 years, but he packed a lot into those 20 years.
He did indeed. He did indeed. We have a lot of questions that revolve around gender, so I'm so glad that you eliminated the gender question right from the start.
But apparently I didn't.
Well, so here's the question. Here's the gist of the question. Is God's mandate for work different for men and women?
So, contrary to what you may be thinking, I knew exactly what he was going to ask before he did. And it's a very fair question. And it's come up a lot since the book came out. and I'm going to answer it, but I want to give a caveat real quickly. It is not that I'm unaware of the additional nuance or complexity that then comes into how this question gets answered in the context of what Christians believe about men and women in the home and so forth. I'm totally aware of it, and it was not an accident that I forgot to cover it in the book. It just wasn't the subject of the book. Like there was a desire for me to be focused on vocational theology. Here's a compliment I want to give to women everywhere. And this applies just in a sociologically broad sense. Where we have a crisis right now in labor participation, where we have a crisis in, I think, systemic video game playing and recreational drug use and an inability to launch and staying at home with mom and dad till you're 33 years old, it's entirely men. And so, again, back to the low-hanging fruit and leverage, I think that there is a much stronger need for prime working age men at different stages of life to adopt this message. And so that's where my passion and animation was in writing the book. For young men, I want to see them grab hold of work, including the early stage jobs that are not super romantic, and embrace them with a theological passion. For middle-aged people like myself, I cannot stand the dualism that is so prevalent in evangelicalism today that talks about, well, now it's time to move from your success to your significance. Let's take the middle age of your life and move into the second half, and now you're going to really do something. It's good that in the first half you paid off your house and you got your kids through college and you built a nest egg. You've done that success stuff, but now we'll do the significant stuff. And that's a systemic issue, again, mostly targeted by the world at men. And that Gen X midlife crisis message was a big subject in my book. And then I already talked about the baby boomers and retirees and that whole deal. So again, there's a lot of these elements here that kind of lent themselves to what the book was naturally targeted at. And yet people will say, well, wait a second, is there a message in there for women or not? And my answer is absolutely. I never say in the book that the production of goods and services that meet the needs of humanity, which is my definition of work, requires compensation. Now, obviously, generally speaking, survival requires compensation, but the division of labor in a home, the idea of what work a woman may be doing in the home or outside the home, what the particulars are for a given family, this to me became tangential to the underlying mission of the book, and so that's why I didn't go there. But do I believe that homemaking meets the definition of work?
Yeah.
I'd say so. and so I very much believe that work, as I am talking about it in the book, can be and should be applied with a broader definition, scope, and understanding than just careerism. But careerism was the itch I was more looking to scratch with this book. And I don't think a lot of people have written a book in defense of Christian careerism, but candidly, a lot of people, including folks who have spoken at this conference, have written better stuff than I could write about the other aspect of this that you're asking about.
We have several questions here.
I'll go more succinct in my answers.
Well, no, this is good. We have a slew of questions, but several of them revolve around the concept of the ruthless elimination of hurry and of Sabbath keeping. So address both of those. They actually may be sort of one thing.
In my opinion, they are. I have a chapter in the book that repudiates this idea of work-life balance. It's something I've spoken about a lot. And I happen to believe that the language of work-life balance is preposterous and dangerous, and a concoction made up by millennials to work less. Okay? And I don't. Do you know what's?
That's true.
It's always difficult when you're in a position like George and I are. You speak a lot, and everyone's laughing, and you didn't mean it to be funny.
But it was funny.
However, I'm well aware of what people mean. They say we don't want to work 24/7 and suffer burnout. And I say, okay, well, first of all, work-life balance is grammatically incoherent. You don't balance something that is a key part of something with the something. And I say all the time, how many of you go home and your spouse talks to you and you go, excuse me, I'm sorry, I can't do this right now. I'm doing some marriage-life balance.
I haven't tried that one.
I'm gonna recommend you keep it that way. So we don't talk about kid life balance, church life balance, marriage life balance. We talk about work-life balance, and we do it because it is a subtle and a reasonably innocuous way, or seemingly innocuous way, to put downward pressure on work. And what it fundamentally means is generally a 26-year-old that wants to go to yoga class at 3 in the afternoon, or Bernie Sanders wanting a 32-hour work week, or some form of downward pressure on the meaning significance of work. And what I say in the book is you don't need work-life balance when God gave us in the created normative model a work-rest paradigm. I already know the mathematical ratio. It's 6-to-1. And I know it because God did it, and I know it because God told us to do it, and I know it because God told us to do it because he did it. All of those were laid out very clearly. And so when you get into these different issues about people suffering burnout, working too hard, or then on the other side of it, this obsession with self-care and these other Rousseauian drivel ideas, I just believe from the bottom of my heart that if people would take Sabbath seriously, that they wouldn't have to worry about the rest of this. Yet, I want to be clear, I do not believe God made us to work so we can rest. I believe he made us to rest so we can work, and I think that cause and effect is very different.
All right, here's a question that is sort of repeated in a number of different ways. Some of the questions revolved around luxury. Some of them revolved around investment in Wall Street. But the essence of all of the questions was, is it possible for work to sometimes actually be a curse?
Well, grammatically, I guess what I would say is that in those cases where one's work is, and I'm not sure how that connects to the Wall Street investment sides, but we'll parse it out.
Doing things that might be contributing to harm.
Oh, okay. So in this case, production of goods and services that meet the needs of humanity is my definition of work. And is it possible to produce something that only does harm? Let's say, pornography or some form of a narcotic that, we could talk about a socially destructive good or a socially destructive or morally corrosive service. And so in that particular case, all we've done is switch the category. That the sin is not the work, it's the underlying activity, right? We wouldn't say like, hey, what do you do? I'm a hitman. Hey, you should probably work a little less, bro. But we laugh because it is funny. Like no one thinks the sin of paid for hire murder is workaholism, right? So in that case, I don't think it's that hard to answer. I think that when we are engaged in harmful production of goods and services, there is sinful activity going on, but the sin is the sin, not the work. And I think that is a category distinction.
We have one final gift for you, a bottle of wine and a gift card for more books because we want to feed you well so that there will be more books from you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you. Thanks so much. Appreciate it.